The Prime Minister is on holiday and his cabinet appears to be at war. Amid an energy crisis with soaring bills for individuals and industries, Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng attempted to calm the waters yesterday in a round of TV appearances. He said that he was working with the Treasury in order to smooth over the crisis and potentially even find some ways to support businesses. So that's all good then, right? Wrong. Treasury sources were quick to hit back against the Business Secretary, denying there were any talks at all. In one extraordinary briefing, Treasury sources went as far as to tell a journalist that, and I quote, "This is not the first time the Business Secretary has made things up in interviews." Unusually tough talk. Now, it is legitimate to question whether the government should be using taxpayer cash to prop up businesses that failed to plan for a change in energy prices. Indeed, implicitly, that would be a punishment for those prudent businesses that did choose to plan. Yet the idea that this all has to be played out in public is unedifying, to say the least. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister is sunning himself on the Costa del Sol, where there are few fears over the heating bill. We'll be discussing this all with our expert guests in a few moments' time. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the UK is shaping itself up for another EU bust-up. The Northern Irish Protocol isn't always the most straightforward or engaging story to follow, but I promise this week's developments are important, and we'll have a full explainer for you later in the show. And today is the day that Wales introduces COVID passports. But are they necessary? And how did one technological mishap end us up in this situation? We'll dive into all of these details later on with another excellent guest. You're watching The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Now, we're going to dive into this bust-up between the Treasury and the Business Secretary, who, of course, as I explained a second ago, went on the morning round yesterday to talk about how he could help businesses and industries that are facing an energy crisis. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by former Labour advisor Scarlett Maguire and the political commentator and broadcaster MAHYAR TOUSI to talk through this situation. Now, Scarlett, to start off, you used to sort of advise on communications for the Labour Party. How would you rate the Tory party communications this weekend out of 10?
I mean, possibly 2. I mean, honestly, and it would be really hilarious if it wasn't so serious, right? I mean, you can't have. So you have the Treasury saying one thing, the Business Secretary saying another, the Treasury basically saying the Business Secretary tells us a lot of lies, and meanwhile the Prime Minister goes on holiday. Fine. Boris Johnson needs a holiday. But we know that when he's not there, there is complete chaos. And when he's not there, he really isn't there. It's not like he's going to be taking calls all through it. It is, I mean, it is appalling. And the worst thing is, of course, is they knew about this for weeks. This isn't a crisis that happened yesterday. This is something that's been building up, that the energy firms need to know where they are. If the government is going to say, well, we're not bailing you out, we're not going to help you, we're not going to do anything, then say it. But this, yes, we'll help, and then, no, we're not going to do anything. Where are we? I mean, this is like a banana republic. It is terrible.
Strong words. Mike, what do you say to that? Are we living in a banana republic under Boris Johnson?
I'm not sure about that, but in terms of communication, it's a weird government because so I'm going to be quite objective. They are at times very good with communication with things that the rest of the public, especially Tory supporters, would kind of get angry about. Like, how did you get away with this? Like, the policy is so crazy or the action is so crazy, but you still have the support. But with tiny stuff that, in terms of management, should be easier, they always mess up. But in this case, usually there are both sides kind of, you understand that there's one right side, one wrong side. There's no such thing. Both the Treasury side and the Business Secretary side, they both did the wrong thing at the wrong time. For example, we know that unfortunately ministers and politicians come out and sometimes say things that, without realising or essentially unintentionally lying. And Kwasi's intention was to kind of calm things down, and he just said something like, oh yeah, of course I'm talking to my colleagues in Treasury. The problem is, these things always come out, but the civil servants and the state usually don't really come out publicly to attack them back, unless the row is essentially personal between them on a professional level. I think that's the problem, that we should have kept it quiet unless it was a big lie in that regard. It's just arguable that the minister lied about something. We don't have to come out to completely attack, and that's the biggest problem.
It is very unusual to see the Treasury actually come out and say this. I mean, surely if you wanted sort of a cohesive government, the Treasury would say, oh, no, I'm sure we are talking, we have had meetings with the Business Secretary, and be ambiguous about it. This seems like a personal animosity.
Yeah, that was the shock. I mean, you're absolutely right, is that it would be so easy to say, well, you know, I don't think we agree, but we are talking, right? And instead they go, oh, no, And this isn't the first time he said things that are not true. I mean, you know, it is hilarious. It's our wonderful soap.
I've been speaking to some MPs over the last few days who say that the Treasury has a bit of an unusually obstinate attitude when it comes to requests. And I wonder if this is something that... I wonder where we gauge the blame lies here. Is this a Business Secretary who is out of his depth, or is this a Treasury that is deliberately stirring the pot?
I mean, I do think there is no question that Rishi Sunak is an ideologue. I mean, that he absolutely believes in getting the deficit down, that he is frankly at war with quite a lot of other people, including his Prime Minister. And whether it's about that and how much out of his depth, I mean, because actually quasi-Quarteng, I mean, he wrote, you know, he was one of the people who wrote for Britannia Unchained. It's not
which was the book that said that, that proposed a lot of sort of very free market solutions for the problems that this country faced. So you'd normally put Kwasi in sort of the more free market wing alongside
Precisely.
Rishi.
I mean, that's what... And obviously when reality hits and actually you have to leave the ideology behind and you do have to talk to business, you realise that things are a bit different. But, I mean, what's incredible is the Treasury, and this is the beginning of a long... I mean, the Treasury is fighting hard, and you just feel over and over again they're just going to say, no, the market will decide, we are not going to have a deficit, we're not going to do any spending without taxes going up. I mean... difficult.
I mean, just for the second, in terms of Kwasi, for example, saying the wrong thing, we have to be careful not to completely put the Treasury and the civil servants on a pedestal, because, of course, they've always been difficult, and of course, you would say that Rishi Sunak is an ideologue in reality, but actually in action, in his government, he's actually been quite pragmatic. Even though he wanted to do the ideological stuff, he's actually kind of compromised a lot. But the Treasury, they opened its door to more chaos. We've been criticising the departments like the Home Office and these guys for briefing the press, for complaining. Treasury, until now, they've been very quiet, like MI5, MI6. Just no one even talks about them. Now, they're opening doors to a lot of gossip.
And in Rishi Sunak's conference speech last week, he sort of took aim at those who put ideology above pragmatism, sort of described himself as a great pragmatist, has cited the furlough scheme, cited the tax rises even. I mean, is this a government where people are sort of arguing amongst themselves in order to sort of reach an, I don't know, sort of an ethereal sense of being free market, whereas in practice they're not that at all?
Yes, I mean, it's to be fair, I don't really think that the way Rishi Sunak and the whole government are tackling all these issues, when they come out to party conference, try to keep the members happy, saying that we're still right-wing, we don't want to raise taxes, and half an hour later they brief the president we're raising taxes. It's kind of confusing for members and the voters and the whole country, because we can't really tell if they're pragmatic or ideological, because you have a situation where the actions are Macmillanites, the Harold Macmillan sort of government, and then they have the rhetoric of Thatcher. And then they have the chaos in terms of mismanagement of the PR, like Donald Trump. Like, I'm not really sure what's going on.
What a cocktail, what an image.
I mean, what one feels is that Rishi Sunak, I mean, the COVID situation just pushed him into absolutely having to deal with things and actually taking a lot of his ideas, strangely enough, from the Resolution Foundation, who were saying, well, why don't you do this? And 3 days later, they would find that it was legislation. They were in shock, I can say. But actually, the COVID situation showed the difference between ideology and real life. I mean, you know, we couldn't have millions and millions of people not being able to survive. But now he's trying to pull it back. But of course, he does have this Prime Minister who really likes cake and eat it. I mean, he really likes saying, oh, well, we'll just do this. We'll have 2 million on a new lot. We'll have to do this. We'll do that. I mean, I think it's really difficult. But I think you're right. I think it's very interesting the way the Treasury always silent before, silent, whichever government, right? There's nothing new. Suddenly is saying quite strange things, yeah.
Well, you mentioned our cakeist Prime Minister there. And this is a man who's currently on holiday at a time where there are a few crises in the country. But the Tory party, according to the last YouGov poll, I think it was on Thursday, 8 points ahead of the Labour Party in the polls. I mean, Boris Johnson being on holiday right now doesn't seem to matter. Maybe cakeism is a real philosophy. Maybe he can have his cake and eat it.
Well, I have to say that, and we always say, you know, divided parties, though obviously Labour is pretty divided at the moment, lose elections. I mean, what one sort of feels is that he's sort of... it's like a cartoon, right? Is that he's running on air and then suddenly it's going to go down. It is going to implode because there are so many things coming up at the moment. I mean, it's just one thing, all of which are entirely predictable, all of which have been predicted since the summer.
And there is a theory about that sort of... I hadn't heard it described as a cartoon running on air before, but I have heard it as sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. And it seemed with Jeremy Corbyn that you had so many stories coming out and nothing seemed to harm him, and he seemed to be level pegging with Theresa May so long in the polls, whether it was stories about his past, his associations, all of these things. And then suddenly the Salisbury affair, where he failed to point to the obvious fact that the Kremlin had ordered an assassination on British soil and sort of almost took the Kremlin line on this sort of stuff. For a lot of voters, that was the point where suddenly their minds changed and suddenly all the other things started to matter. I think that there's something in that there could be a moment where something changes for Boris, that suddenly everything that's piled up before now starts to matter. Maya, do you have a view on that? Yes,
I think there could be a moment when either the Jenga will collapse, or it will also, in a weird way, one story will actually help him, one crisis to actually kind of bring him up again. This story about, for example, a Prime Minister going on holiday is actually quite too ridiculous. That I've now been critical of Boris and his government on certain issues. There are a lot of things that you can actually criticise them about and actually scrutinise them. This is quite silly because people are treating a role of the Prime Minister as like a normal person or like a CEO. Where if you go, actually, CEO is also a bad example because even they're the same. If they go on holiday, they're not like, off the grid. They still obviously have to be in touch. They're not completely relaxing. And, you know, it's been a long time since been on actual abroad, proper holidays, gone through all this stuff, including, obviously, death in family, obviously, having a baby, having a number of crises. Firstly, give him a break. Secondly, you know, if only there were some inventions that you could obviously, like, even when you're away, you could still, like, you know, talk to someone, or maybe like a video sort of call. Maybe call them Zoom and phones. If we had them, I think we do, I think the PM should be fine. Just let him be, because what you do is when you attack people like Boris Johnson, or actually even Donald Trump in this case, these people are muds. The more you attack them personally, you can't throw mud at mud. You actually unintentionally make them more popular. Attack them on the things that matter, and actually the things that they mess up properly, electoral policy. Personal attacks make Boris Johnson more popular.
But I think I mean, I agree with you that he needs to go on holiday. I think the problem is that you feel that when Boris Johnson is on holiday, there is chaos left behind. I mean, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, he was at Chequers trying to finish his book, which seems to still not be finished. But so, I mean, what happened was there was chaos. He didn't get to meetings. The COVID wasn't taken seriously.
Is this a personal political attack, though? I'm just thinking from a Labour communications perspective. If you're the Labour Party, do you really want to be saying, actually, the problem here is that Boris Johnson isn't in charge enough, and if he's there and in charge, then everything is fine?
No, we know that. We know from the last few months that when he's in charge, nothing happens. So, but you just feel that once, you know, it's like the playground, isn't it? They're all arguing among themselves because, of course, this is politics. Everybody's thinking, can I be his successor? I mean, there is no question about the ambition of Rishi Sunak. And all that's what's happening is everybody's putting their stake. Yeah, I agree. I mean, whether Boris Johnson is on holiday or not is pretty remote. The fact that we've got a government in chaos when, you know, the shelves are empty, the petrol station I went past didn't have any petrol in it, so there were no queues. I mean, that's today. We all knew this was coming down. I mean, how can we allow this amount of chaos?
So how does the Labour Party get their message across here? How, as a Labour Party, are you going to be able to squeeze that 8-point lead in the polls, both of you, as the final point in this conversation?
Yeah, I think the Labour Party has to come out and say this is what should be happening. Is I think criticism isn't enough. I think the Labour Party needs to say this is what happens. I mean, of course, they don't meet with everybody. They don't know the granular. But what they need to do is to say, if we were in charge, this is our direction of travel. Because what we need to do is to look from chaos to stability, and we need to see that stability.
And final word to you, MAHYAR.
Yeah, unfortunately, usually that should be the case. You advise them to do this, but that is just not working, and this is the phase that they have to go through, because people think that Starmer and the Labour Party are just agreeing with the government, there's no opposition. In fact, it's actually the other way around. Every time Starmer or Labour come up with some sort of solution or idea, the government just steals it. So it's just, unfortunately, they can't really offer anything else new, because, they say, oh, raise taxes. Well, we'll do it anyway. So they just have to go through this phase with Starmer. Then they need a proper reform again as a party to get their act together. One side, one faction, either has to basically wipe out the other one or try to compromise and actually get the... Because this hybrid doesn't work.
More factions.
Hold on, this is a whole other thing. I mean, I actually think that there was a choice of unity, and I think Keir Starmer could have taken it, and I think it would have been fine. I don't think there needs to be factionalism in the Labour Party. I think it could have been fine, and I think that is a problem, that they're finding factionalism.
We need Squid Game or Hunger Games for the Labour parties.
No, I'm disagreeing.
Well, on that note, Scarlett Maguire, former Labour advisor, and MAHYAR TOUSI, political commentator, thank you so much for joining me for this discussion this morning. Really, really interesting. Thanks. Well, after that, let's move on to another issue that's going to dominate this week in politics. What on earth is going on with the Northern Ireland Protocol? This is usually a dry issue, but there are important goings-on, and I promise these next few minutes are really worth your time. Understanding this issue is vital for the unity of our country. The protocol was established as a compromise devised under the dying days of a hung parliament, designed to ensure no hard border on the island of Ireland, allowing the free flow of goods from north to south. It means that while Northern Ireland is within the UK's customs union and outside the European Union, the protocol also keeps Northern Ireland in the EU's single market for goods. Inside the UK's customs union, inside the EU's single market, a halfway house that creates some trade barriers with the rest of the UK. What checks there are between Great Britain and Northern Ireland are meant to be light touch and non-intrusive, yet they plainly aren't. Some shortages are being seen on Northern Irish shelves. Bureaucracy, intense quality checks, risk even medicines being disrupted. These are the same medicines that are freely available on the shelves as things stand, but that are put at risk by what the European Union describes as concerns about the integrity of its own market. As if goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland are of such implausibly poor quality that they could somehow pollute the EU, or that almost everything has to be checked in order to spot intense smuggling. The UK has grounds for serious complaint that the EU is implementing the terms of the agreement too officiously, against the spirit of the protocol in the first place. Indeed, under the terms of the agreement, trade diversion, as it's called, or serious economic, societal or environmental difficulties must not be created. The now famous Article 16 break clause of the protocol states that any party to that agreement can unilaterally take safeguarding action if the application of this protocol leads to serious economic, societal or environmental difficulties that are liable to persist, or to the diversion of trade, as that protocol states. Well, back in September, the UK said that those conditions were met, although at first held back from triggering Article 16, saying that before it does, the UK will attempt a fresh negotiated settlement. This is in the context of soured relations after the EU threatened to trigger Article 16 in January this year in order to disrupt the flow of vaccines. Although the bloc backtracked from its extraordinary and callous threat, this widened the offered window of what was deemed possible. If the Europeans could threaten to trigger Article 16, Britain can too. And that leads us to where we are now. On Wednesday, the EU will bring forward proposals on reforming the protocol. Some look very positive. Reports suggest that the EU's proposals will effectively do away with all paperwork for goods destined for Northern Ireland, a significant change. Instead of a goods border in the Irish Sea, there would be a sort of green lane for goods going to and staying in Northern Ireland, and a red checked lane for goods intending to travel beyond Northern Ireland. Interesting stuff, but there's a sting to it. The European Union looks like it will offer no concessions on the role of its courts in dispute settlement. The UK wants more independent arbitration, while the EU wants its institutions intimately involved. Well, enter Irish Foreign Affairs Minister Simon Coveney, who attempted what can only be described as the opposite of diplomacy on Twitter last night. He accused the UK government of creating a new red line to progress. The Irish minister then went as far as to question whether the UK government wants a breakdown in relations. An extraordinary statement. The UK's chief Brexit negotiator, Lord Frost, hit back, also on Twitter. He explained that the UK set out its concerns around the Court of Justice of the EU back in July, not suddenly now, as Coveney deceptively suggested. This is a black and white issue, and not the first time the EU has stuck its foot in it. Significant differences clearly remain. Tensions are clearly high, yet also a way through is possible. The Europeans can see that something must be done, and this week will be crucial. Tomorrow, Lord Frost is to give a speech in which he will tell diplomats that removing the European Court's role in dispute settlement is crucial to sustain the protocol. And then on Wednesday, the EU will set out its own proposals. We heard a flavour of them just then. Well, will it have listened to Lord Frost and accept the UK's long-standing concerns as legitimate? Or will it risk blowing up the protocol altogether? That remains to be seen. Well, moving away from Brussels to somewhere closer to home. People in Wales now need an NHS Covid pass to be able to legally attend big events or nightclubs. They're compulsory for over 18s and show people either have tested negative on a lateral flow test or are fully vaccinated against Covid. Wales's rugby game against New Zealand on the 30th of October will be one of the first mass events to require Covid passes. Some nightclub bosses say they felt singled out by the rules, but others said they felt reassured. Well, I'm joined now by the Welsh political commentator and host of Rich Politics podcast, Richard Taylor. Welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you, Tom.
Firstly, I want to go through how these vaccine passports came about, because there was a bit of confusion last week when there was a vote in the Senedd whereby one Tory said that he couldn't vote because of technical issues. What went on?
Yeah, well, the vote last Tuesday was significant for Wales because it's going to have huge societal impact now, especially you've mentioned the businesses and nightclub industries and large events. As of today, people like myself and many others will be excluded from parts of society based on the fact we don't want to show our medical status. How it came about, however, is more worrying because it brings into question our democratic process. When you consider that a member of the Senedd, Gareth Davies from Clwyd, he was up at the conference in Manchester. What he was doing there, I really don't know.
Well, he's a Conservative member.
He was Conservative.
And was at the Conservative Party
Yes,
conference.
he was. Whether in official capacity or not, I don't really know. But with a vote of such magnitude and the outcomes of this vote, my personal opinion is he should have been in the chamber, at least, or remotely. Now, apparently, he tried to access the IT system hybrid voting we have in Wales currently. Again, another issue. Why are we having hybrid voting at the moment when Westminster is back in full capacity? Why is Wales doing it differently? Nevertheless, he couldn't get through, and the presiding officer had a break before the vote went through. There was a break. During that break, she went and tried to phone the member personally on his mobile phone, and she would have taken his vote over the phone orally. Wow. That means if he had said, and he intended, Tom, by all intents and purposes from his Twitter account and social media, to vote against it. So what would have happened on Tuesday hasn't happened, which would have been that vaccine passports would have been, that vote would have been dead in the water.
So that vote passed by one vote?
By one vote. Now, had it gone to a deadlock, what would have happened in how it works in the Senedd? the presiding officer or Speaker of the House in Westminster, the two comparisons, they would have the casting vote, and she cannot vote in favour with the government or the motion, which means she would have had to have voted against as well. The surprising thing was to see all the opposition parties, including Plaid Cymru, who normally vote in favour with Welsh Labour, voted against this motion. But as a result of this one, what some have called a technical glitch, I think some responsibility has to lay in both areas. The presiding officer could have delayed the vote. It's been done before in the Senedd, but she didn't do anything untoward. She was well within the right to let it go and say time is up, which is what she did. But Gareth Davies still has questions to answer. And I don't think this is going to go away. The legitimacy of the vote, because of the impact it's going to have. If I can tell you, a large golfing resort in Wales, a friend of mine who looks after events there contacted me and has told me 2 events this week have been cancelled, and they've lost literally hundreds of thousands of pounds because they're not ready to implement vaccine passports, which is some of the consequences of this ridiculous decision. That aside, the discrimination involved, which I've mentioned on this programme many times before, and the other aspects as well. And I think, you know, it brings our whole democratic process into question, Tom.
No, that's a really fascinating story in terms of how this came about. And it's interesting you mention that some events have already been cancelled. Up in Scotland, where they brought in a similar scheme of vaccine passports just a week or two ago, and there were some huge technical errors in terms of the app coming on last minute, people not being able to download it, lots and lots of problems. But there was a grace period then of around a month where this wouldn't be enforced for a while. Is that not the case in Wales?
No, it's not. As of 7 o'clock this morning, it's now been implemented into law. This isn't a suggestion. This is actually a legal requirement, and there'll be fines issued. And I was at the protest on Tuesday outside the Senedd against vaccine passports. And it was interesting. I spoke to a number of police officers there, and the police officer in particular I spoke to said, we don't know how we're going to police this. We've had no information from the Welsh Government. We don't know how we're supposed to respond to reports that come in. I've spoken to the nightclub industry. I know you may have someone on later on today from the association who said it's not practical. I mean, let's be honest, most people who go to a nightclub, they've been to a pub all afternoon, and they're probably steaming drunk before they get there. Can you imagine the aggression they're going to face on the doors when a bouncer says to somebody, hey, you haven't got a COVID pass, you can't come in. Now, I don't advocate violence, obviously, but you can see where this is going to be very difficult for the nightlife industry to actually impose. And, of course, things like, I'm a patriotic Welshman, as you can tell from my accent. I can't go and watch my beloved Wales play rugby because I refuse to show my medical status. And there are many people in Wales, I feel, that feel let down by this politician in particular, Gareth Davies, because he should have been, let's be honest, if you're at the Conservative conference, there's a huge vote that's going to change society in Wales. And this morning, Matt Drakeford, First Minister, has already said that restrictions, which we still have in Wales, mask wearing in supermarkets, social distancing, is still in place in Wales. I know it's not in England. He has stated this morning he's going to continue this into 2022. So we're still living with those restrictions.
No, it does seem extraordinary. I mean, in terms of a scale of interventions in the economy, I would think that vaccine passports are probably preferable to asking businesses to shut altogether. But the idea that we've reached that stage already is curious, given where we are in terms of the COVID situation in the country. Not an exponential rise in cases, sort of bumbling around, deaths relatively stable. Why is it that the Welsh Labour Party's cancelled its conference? Why are they taking the data to mean something differently than indeed the English... I was at the English Labour Party conference 2 weeks ago. My gosh, there wasn't a mask to be seen. They were singing karaoke together. What is it about the Welsh Labour Party that's so different from the English Labour Party?
I think Mark Drakeford is known as a very cautious man. He's a grandfather figure in Wales to a lot of people, and I've witnessed it and seen it myself firsthand when I've met him personally. And I think that cautious approach is what he's always put into his whole pitch when it comes to, looking after the regulations in Wales and caring for the people of Wales. That's been his pitch. But, that doesn't really help people in Wales, in my opinion. We've had the biggest vaccine rollout in the whole of the UK in Wales. How vaccine rollout has been huge, and that's a great success for the Welsh Government, and I take my hat off to them. So if we've had such success and immunity now is growing more than it's ever been because people have had COVID and everything else, then surely the introduction of vaccine passports is nothing more than discriminatory, for there's no evidential basis to tell us that it's going to help with the uptake of vaccines. Look at vaccinating children now. Is it 11% of parents have had their 12 to 16-year-olds vaccinated at the moment? This idea that vaccine passports will encourage people to get the vaccine, to me, seems a way of making things mandatory that they say are not. Well,
Rich Taylor, thank you very much for your perspective and that really interesting story and how this all came about. Fascinating politics going on in Wales that no doubt we will keep up with as the weeks and months progress. Well, you've watched The Briefing this morning on GB News. Thank you so much for your company. After the break, To The Point will be here with Patrick Christie's and Mercy Muroki. But first, let's take a little look at the weather.